Actually, the formal inauguration of the temple did not begin until 11 months after the temple was completed, because it was an event. And Solomon had it scheduled for the very best time, because it was the Feast of Booths. And that was, it was going to be a 2-week event. You're putting on 1 week, just 2 weeks. And this is grand, but it's not quite on the same scale as the temple. A lot of preparations. And the Feast of Booths was appropriate and proper because it illustrated the Israelites wandering for 40 years, and they were in tents and so forth. And it would remind them, when now they have this structure, they have this permanent national worship center, and no longer is it a tent. And it was also the harvest festival, according to Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 8 through 11. So in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 22, it says that, Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel, and spread out his hands towards heaven. Now we're beginning to get right into the dedication part. But I want you to see where this is. Here is the altar. This was the a layout of the tabernacle, and the temple layout followed this. The altar is out here in front. You see it in red. This blue circle here was the giant laver. If I just keep percolating, I have some slides of that. You had 2 big columns out here. They were named. They were about 35 feet high, and they were made out of brass. And Boaz was one, and Jachin was the other. Boaz means has to do with strength, and Jachin has to do with being established. And then you have these. Here in orange is the outside of the temple. You have the holy place and the temple. But here's where Solomon was at the altar. This is where this was taking place. Now, if you go to 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 13, you get something filled in there that you don't see in 1 Kings chapter 8. And that is, here it is, 2 Chronicles 6:13. Now Solomon had made a bronze platform, 5 cubits long, 5 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high. That's 7.5 foot square and 5 feet high. And had cast it in the midst of the court. And he stood on it, knelt on his knees in the presence of all the assembly of Israel, and spread out his hands towards heaven. Now this is a prayer. Whenever you go to this much trouble to build a brass stand for this particular prayer, it shows the level of detail that was taken care of. However, it also shows that Solomon is very serious about this. He wants to do a right thing in the right way, something that would be honoring to God. And you have the king on his knees before all the people. What a sight that was. Now, starting in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 25, if you want to go in your Bible, I'm going to give you a few keys that you can just make some maybe little notations that will help you see what this prayer is about. Well, what would you think when he has this prayer? You have I don't know how many wonders of the world there were then, but certainly the temple was one of the wonders of the world, if not the wonder of the world at that time. And he has this brass stand, and the temple has been completed, and he's dedicating it. What do you think his prayer would be about? Would you think that it would be about, well, now that we have the temple, now that we have a solid structure, now that we have a national worship center that we can be so proud of, boy, we can really do great things for God now. If you think that's what the prayer is about, think again. Solomon was very wise. And I'm going to go through these. I'm not going to give you much detail here because I have to press on. But at least it will give you a sense that it had nothing to do with all the great things that they were going to do for God. it had a lot to do with God hearing their prayer and forgiving them when they needed it. Many times throughout this prayer, you're going to hear that. And so in verse 25 through 30, now this is in 1 Kings chapter 8, God's presence and protection is what it was all about. Solomon called on God to continue to be faithful to His promises to David and to them, and to continue to hear their prayers. Do you know that Solomon says this phrase? He uses this phrase, you have Shema. You hear, O Israel, is the word Shema. He uses it 13 times in this prayer. He was imploring God to hear him. And so that's what verses 25 through 30 is about, is praying for presence and protection. Verses 31 and 32 has to do with God's righteous judgment between the people. This would be actually appealing to the Supreme Court in heaven. I wish I had time to go into these, because it's what he's talking about is people are going to be at each other. Here's the new temple. We have a new church here. But guess what stays the same? The people. The old sin nature in the people anyway. And he's saying, look, I know that they're going to be at one another. And then when you go to the context, what you have is somebody lends something to a neighbor and it disappears. And they're going to say, okay, it was stolen. Oh, yeah. Well, we'll see about that. And they're going to go at one another. And he's talking about appealing to the Supreme Court of heaven there. In verses 33 through 34, you have forgiveness of sins that had caused defeat in battle. They had been defeated in battle before, and he knew that they would be defeated in the future. And he's saying that there are certain sins that God sees so grievous that they would need to ask God to forgive them so that they could have victory in battle. That was verses 33 through 34. Then in verses 35 through 36, he wanted forgiveness of sins that would bring on a drought. You understand that Solomon is essentially imploring God to hear his prayer and to be ready to forgive all these people that are going to do these sins, that are going to bring on defeat in battle and also drought. You know what that took on the people's part? Hopefully, they were humble. They should have been thanking him for doing that. Verses 37 through 40, forgiveness of sins that had resulted in other calamities. Here's some more. A famine, plague, blight, mildew, locusts, grasshoppers, enemies, disasters, and disease were all instruments of God to chasten the people. And he's saying, hear our prayer. These things are going to continue. Now, they had a new temple, and some would say, we're going to make a fresh start. Well, that's good. I mean, it's a good sentiment. But Solomon was a realist. And he said, God, hear our prayer on his knees, hands up to heaven. Forgive us for these things that we are going to do. Verses 41 through 43, mercy for God-fearing foreigners. He even included the foreigners that were among them. Solomon interceded on behalf of non-Israels who would trust God and who would pray to him. And this is one way that God's fame would go throughout all the nations, throughout all the world. There's 9 things, by the way, in this prayer, and we're going to number 7 right now. 44 through 45.